Shin Sang-yun, 55 years old, gasped for breath inside the cave, exhaustion weighing him down. As he steadied himself, he wondered what he was doing at this age when others were preparing for retirement. The thought gnawed at him. His life felt like a failure. A growl snapped him back to reality. A monster peered into the cage where he rested. He muttered under his breath about how they wouldn't even let him catch a moment's breath. As the beasts lunged, he forced himself up, gripping his sword. He thought about the players of his generation, hailed as sword saints, sword gods, legends in their own right. Meanwhile, he was just an old man with a blade, a swordsman mocked for his age, barely acknowledged. He wondered if that wasn't reason enough to question everything. Without a family, Shin had grown up in an orphanage. As a child, he had witnessed a monster holding his teacher in its grasp. Through her pain, she had forced out words of reassurance, telling him not to be scared. She had screamed at him to run. He had stood frozen as the creature crushed her skull, reducing her to nothing. The orphanage, his makeshift family, had been wiped out. When the collapse first tore open the skies, monsters rained down and took everything from him. But he hadn't despaired. Even at the brink of death, someone had arrived. An unknown figure who saved his life. The man had asked if he was okay, but all Shin could do was silently cry, overwhelmed by the miracle of survival. Now, years later, his sword cut through a monster's neck. He fought because of that figure, wanting to be like them, giving everything he had. But no matter how many creatures he slew, he never became stronger, never managed to protect anything. After cutting down the last of the monsters, he drove his sword into the ground, body trembling, exhaustion overtaking him. His body was truly giving out, and he knew how dangerous that was. Then, a deeper, more powerful growl echoed through the battlefield. Confused, he looked up to see a monstrous titan appear before him, its mouth opening wide, preparing to unleash a torrent of fire. As the heat flared in front of him, he let out a slow breath, thoughts spiraling. No home, no family, no dreams. His life had been nothing but failure, a collection of regrets that weighed him down. Tears welled in his eyes as he realized just how badly he had messed up. He wanted to go back. A moment later, Shin Sang-hyun stood victorious over the dungeon's boss. The system congratulated him for clearing the ancient dragon's nest, but instead of feeling accomplished, frustration surged through him. Nearly 60 years old, and he was still pushing himself this hard, 30 years as a swordsman, yet his greatest achievement was ranking in his country's top 100, a meaningless feat in a world overflowing with players. To him, it was like being a single needle lost in an endless haystack. A book materialized before him, prompting him to wonder if his reward was a skill book. He even considered whether it was edible, given that he had consumed artifacts before. Before he could process it further, the dungeon entrance unexpectedly opened, shocking him. The system displayed a message. Constellation, Late Bloomer Model Student, has entered. Late Bloomer, as he casually referred to him, addressed him directly. The system announced that Late Bloomer sincerely blessed him for his hard work and praised his impeccable final strike. It was a dramatic entrance, but Sang-hyun couldn't deny his gratitude. After all, Late Bloomer had contracted with him back when he was nothing more than a third-rate swordsman. Late Bloomer reminded him of a crucial milestone. Upon reaching level 850, all artifact and title stats would double, and at level 900, they would triple. Sang-hyun stared in silence. His current level was 650. The conditions were insane, and despite having a powerful constellation, he had yet to reap any benefits from their contract. Late Bloomer then urged him to consume the skill book. Sang-hyun, unimpressed, responded that he was already planning to do so. Activating Devour Artifacts, the only skill he had gained upon awakening, he consumed the book. His journey to understand his ability had been nothing short of ridiculous. He had boiled, fried, and even experimented with artifacts for years, only to find nothing changed. By the time he realized that mana synchronization with a suitable artifact was the key to activating his skill, 3 decades had already slipped through his fingers. Others had grown stronger the moment they awakened, yet he had wasted precious time. But now, the book remained unchanged. Annoyed, he threw it aside, questioning if it even counted as a skill book. Late Bloomer looked equally shocked before admitting that information on Devour artifacts was extremely limited. Apologizing, he suggested that Sang-hyun try again with mana synchronization, reminding him that there was still plenty of time. Sang-hyun scoffed at the words. What did he mean by a lot of time? Who said he had any time left? He was almost 60. If he had fathered a child at 30, that child would be 30 now. If he had started even earlier, he might have grandchildren by now. He snapped that Late Bloomer wouldn't understand since he was a constellation. Humans die early. Late Bloomer fell silent before offering another quiet apology. Sang-hyun sighed, assuring him it wasn't his fault. His life was simply filled with regrets. Late Bloomer seemed taken aback, but Sang-hyun continued, confessing that he had spent years chasing after a man whose back he could never reach. He had given it his all, but now he was exhausted. He was too old. Late Bloomer remained quiet before eventually smiling, but Sang-hyun was resolute. He told him to take note. He was retiring. Their contract was ending, and Late Bloomer should find another player. As he spoke, a strange purple smoke began to swirl around him. Before he could react, Late Bloomer stood before him, casting an unknown spell. The smoke thickened, dissolving around him. The last thing he saw was the system message. Constellation Late Bloomer model student has utilized an experimental essence. Regression process initiated. Meanwhile, outside the dungeon, player G and reporter Park Jong-min observed the phenomenon. Jong-min asked if this was the typical environment players worked in. Han Hyun-jung, CEO of Hyunjong Corporation, confirmed his assumption, explaining that dungeons were stepping stones for players. Gates, on the other hand, were connections to unknown dimensions, serving as uncharted territories for players to explore and conquer. Back in Sang-hyun's apartment, he absent-mindedly cleaned his dagger while watching a broadcast of Hyunjong explaining the nature of dungeons. The familiarity of the program sent a chill down his spine. It had been years since he had seen the show. As realization set in, he confirmed what had already become clear. He had truly regressed. 4 days had already passed since his return. He had gone back 30 years. When he first woke up, he found himself in his tiny studio apartment, his body no longer that of a weathered 55-year-old warrior, but that of his 25-year-old self. Yet, every memory from his previous life remained intact. No matter how much he thought about it, the only explanation was that this was the work of Late Bloomer, a miracle of the constellation. There was no other reason. As he absent-mindedly rolled his dagger in his hand before catching it, confusion still lingered in his mind. Deciding not to dwell on it, he considered going out to work. The system then displayed information about his weapon, Venomith's Dagger, a bronze artifact with 17 attack power and an additional +10 agility effect. He recognized it as a fortunate find for this time period. Though its rank was low, he knew its hidden skill held significant value. The system indicated that his absorption rate was currently 10%, but since he had used the dagger before, it had increased to 20%. While the rate remained low due to his lack of prolonged use, what truly mattered was the dagger's hidden skill. Without hesitation, he activated mana synchronization, entering the gap of unconsciousness, a necessary passage to absorb an artifact. As he did, his hair turned a shining white. He was always nervous when stepping into the gap, never knowing what form the artifact would take. This time, the dagger transformed into a perfectly cooked fried chicken. The system confirmed that the preparation for absorption was complete, and the dish further evolved into rotisserie barbecue chicken drizzled with olive oil. Relieved that it wasn't something unpleasant, like a humid swamp centipede dish, he happily dug in, commenting that he wouldn't mind eating such a dish any time. Upon consuming the artifact, he permanently gained +2 agility and acquired the hidden skill Demon Bash. With the dagger fully absorbed, it disappeared forever. Though it was a shame to lose the weapon, he was satisfied with the new skill, just as he had planned. Knowing it was time to move forward, he set out. Meanwhile, at dungeon number 85, managed by Team Yoon Dae-kyung, a man rushed toward Yoon Dae-kyung in a panic. Recognizing him as the leader of the Porter group, Dae-kyung immediately asked what the issue was. The man frantically explained that one of his team members, a newcomer who had joined just 4 days ago, Shin Sang-hyun, had suddenly pulled out. Unconcerned, Dae-kyung dismissed his worries, informing him that Sang-hyun had been assigned to the player team, not the Porter team. Shocked, the Porter leader demanded clarification, emphasizing that Sang-hyun had just awakened and hadn't even completed the player academy. Adding an untrained newcomer to the player team was unheard of and would throw off the balance of their teams. Frustrated, he asked how he was supposed to redistribute the work. Dae-kyung sighed, stepping closer. His serious tone sent a chill through the Porter leader as he formally addressed him, reminding him that he was responsible for handling everything: his team, the contribution system, and all necessary adjustments. Unwilling to argue further, the Porter leader awkwardly laughed, apologized, and walked away, though his unease remained. Watching him leave, Dae-kyung exhaled in irritation. His vice guild leader then questioned the decision, admitting that even he found it unexpected. Dae-kyung was taken aback by his skepticism as well, but he had his reasons. If someone had to die, it would be Sang-hyun, not them. Letting him fail spectacularly would put the Porters in their place and reinforce the value of the players. He scoffed at the idea that a level 1 nobody could contribute anything. The vice guild leader laughed, realizing Dae-kyung's true intent, but neither of them knew that Sang-hyun had overheard everything. Calmly, Sang-hyun stepped forward and greeted them, announcing that from today onward, he would be working as a player. The porters glared at him with resentment, while the players sneered at him with amusement. He had expected hostility, but their complete lack of subtlety was almost comical. Daekyung, feigning warmth, approached Sanghyun and welcomed him, remarking that he had expected him to be late on his first day. Spotting his weapon, Daekyung asked if it was a longsword. Sanghyun awkwardly confirmed, explaining that he had studied various combat techniques through YouTube videos. Daekyung barely contained his laughter. A longsword was one of the most difficult weapons to master, yet Sanghyun intended to rely on self-study? Sanghyun, however, remained composed, stating that he would at least try to protect himself and asked Daekyung to trust him. Amused, Daekyung praised his spirit, shouting to the others that men needed to have spirit. With that, he rallied his team, declaring that the dungeon raid was about to begin and urging them to go wild. The players cheered in agreement, stepping through the portal one by one. As Sanghyun followed, Daekyung watched him from behind in silence. He found it laughable that Sanghyun thought dungeons were something he could handle after watching a few online videos. The arrogance of a freshly awakened player irritated him. Sanghyun clearly had a death wish. Daekyung knew this dungeon well. It was an orc dungeon, notorious for being a death trap for inexperienced players. Sanghyun would soon learn his place. To Daekyung, it was just a matter of time. But only moments later, a shocking sight stopped him in his tracks. Orc corpses littered the ground. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. Staring at the aftermath, he found himself asking the one question that suddenly weighed on him more than anything else. Who the hell was Sanghyun? And what had he just witnessed? Orcs were a staple of fantasy settings, common in games, novels, and movies. Because of their prevalence, players often underestimated them, viewing them as weak compared to creatures like dragons. While orcs lacked intelligence and relied on brute force, their sheer physicality made them formidable. Because of this, new players who are arrogant often jump into a fight against orcs without really thinking too much. They often underestimate them, leading to their demise. Standing at an average height of 250 centimeters and weighing around 180 kilograms, they held a significant power advantage over humans. This overwhelming strength earned them the infamous nickname, the Wall of Lament. As the team ventured deeper into the dungeon, one of the players reminded Sanghyun that he wouldn't receive any special treatment as a newcomer. He was on his own. The leader of the porter team scoffed at him, spitting on the ground before questioning why he was acting like a full-fledged player so soon after awakening. Calling him arrogant, the man openly mocked him, but Sanghyun only responded with an awkward laugh, promising to do his best. The porter leader, unimpressed, snapped at him to not just try, but to actually prove himself. Despite the hostility, Sanghyun remained calm and asked if he could fight on the front line should they encounter a monster. The request left the man speechless before he burst out in disbelief, questioning if Sanghyun had lost his mind. Before he could respond further, a sudden shout rang out. An orc had appeared behind them. Gripping his sword tightly, Sanghyun recognized this as his first battle since regressing. He was about to volunteer to handle it when another player lunged forward, shield raised, and shoved the orc back. The man cursed at Sanghyun, furious at his recklessness, and demanded to know how he planned to wield a great sword with such sluggish movement. Sanghyun, unfazed, assured him that he didn't need any help. The man growled in frustration, telling him to stop running his mouth and prove his worth. Unaware that the orc was already raising its weapon to strike, Sanghyun warned him to look ahead, but the man, still irritated, dismissed it. Only when the massive axe came swinging down did he realize the danger. A gasp of terror escaped him as he stared at the incoming attack, unable to react in time. At the last moment, Daekyung intervened, ramming his shield into the orc and sending it crashing to the ground. Irritated by the careless exchange, Daekyung barked at them, demanding if they had come to the dungeon for a picnic. The player quickly apologized while the rest of the group watched in awe. Regaining control of the situation, Daekyung ordered everyone to stand back. He would handle the orc himself. The monster, enraged by the interruption, lunged forward once more. Its axe came down in a powerful arc, but Daekyung braced his shield against the impact before thrusting his sword forward, piercing the orc's chest. The spectators erupted in praise, assuming the fight was over. However, the orc's eyes snapped open, burning with fury. Roaring in rage, it tore the embedded sword from its chest and swung its axe with even greater force. The ground beneath them cracked as the weapon struck, narrowly missing Daekyung, who managed to leap back just in time. Cursing under his breath, he realized he hadn't finished the job. Sanghyun observed the battle in silence. Daekyung was the highest leveled player present, yet even at level 50, he struggled to land a decisive hit. Frustrated, Daekyung launched another attack, driving his sword into the same wound while shouting for the orc to die. This time, as he withdrew the blade, the orc collapsed lifelessly. The team erupted into cheers, amazed that he had single-handedly slain the creature. Laughing, Daekyung dismissed their praise, ensuring everyone was unharmed before preparing to move forward. Before they could proceed, however, the sound of guttural growls echoed through the dungeon. The ground trembled as a swarm of monsters emerged, orcs wielding crude weapons, accompanied by high orcs and armored orcs. The sight of the reinforced enemies sent a wave of panic through the team as they turned to Daekyung, desperate for direction. Forcing himself to stay composed, Daekyung instructed the team to fall back for safety, though internally, he was reeling. If he had barely managed to defeat a single orc, how could they possibly face an entire horde? Before he could formulate a plan, Sang-hyun unexpectedly spoke up, asking if he could take a shot at them. His words sent shock through the group. Outraged, the players snapped at him, questioning if he had lost his mind. Daekyung, trying to reason with him, acknowledged his excitement over awakening but insisted that this was no time for reckless bravado. But before he could finish his sentence, Sang-hyun had already dashed forward. Alarmed, Daekyung shouted after him, warning that he was heading straight to his death. Sang-hyun ignored him, gripping his sword tightly as he closed in on the nearest orc. With a single downward swing of his greatsword, the massive creature was cleaved cleanly in half. Silence fell over the battlefield. Everyone stood frozen, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Someone muttered in disbelief, questioning if they had really just seen an orc felled in one strike. Meanwhile, Sang-hyun casually rested his longsword against his shoulder, musing to himself that the cut wasn't quite as smooth as he expected, perhaps because he was still only level 1. The system window confirmed his status. Level 1. No title. No constellation. His only skill was Devour Artifact. His health stood at 200, mana at 20, and experience at 40. Yet, despite these modest stats, he had just effortlessly cut down a creature that had nearly overwhelmed the highest-ranked player in their party. The orcs, enraged by the sight of their comrade being sliced in half, rushed toward him in unison. Despite their aggression, he remained calm, remarking that while he may be low level, he had plenty of experience. Without hesitation, he cut down the advancing orcs with effortless precision, their bodies torn apart in a single sweep. Before he could advance further, the armored orc, their leader, brought its massive hammer crashing down. He narrowly avoided the strike, dodging with ease before countering in a single fluid motion, slicing the armored orc clean in half. As its body collapsed, he questioned if it had any idea how many orcs he had killed when he was younger. His team stood frozen, struggling to believe what they were witnessing. Doubt filled their expressions as they questioned if this was truly the same person they had known. However, as they watched him cut through the horde with ease, it became clear. He might actually wipe out every last one of them. As he swung his longsword once more, he locked eyes with the remaining armored orc, the true leader. Declaring it the last one, he readied himself. The orc, filled with fury, swung its massive club at him. Anticipating the attack, he leaped back just in time, evading it effortlessly. In a flash, he closed the distance, landing a powerful strike against its back. Yet, instead of cutting through, the blade barely left a scratch. Daekyung, watching in shock, shouted out that the orc's skin was too thick. The attack had failed. If their weapons couldn't pierce it, they were in serious trouble. The orc retaliated instantly, swinging its axe backward with lethal speed. Just as the blade was about to reach his neck, it came to an abrupt stop, hovering an inch away. Daekyung's breath hitched, expecting the worst. But the only response was a calm assurance that there was no need for panic, even with the axe so close to taking his head. The orc attempted to move but found itself completely frozen in place. Thanks to his Demon Bash skill, a status abnormality had taken effect, hindering the orc's movements for 2 full seconds. The duration depended on the target's skill resistance, but it was enough. With an amused tone, he taunted the orc, instructing it to stay still. The creature let out a furious, terrified scream, struggling in vain. Without wasting a moment, he swung his sword, cleanly severing its head. The orc's head landed at Daekyung's feet. Silence hung in the air as the reality of what had just happened sank in. Daekyung, still in shock, questioned what he had just witnessed. Just days ago, Sang-hyun had only recently awakened. How was this even possible? Doubt filled his mind. The hindrance skill Sang-hyun had just used wasn't an ultra-short hindrance, yet even a named player's best attempt would last only 1.5 seconds. The others murmured among themselves, questioning if he had an unnatural talent for the greatsword. Some jokingly wondered if he had simply watched some overpowered tutorial videos online. But Daekyung remained stunned, unable to comprehend how someone who had awakened only days ago could perform at this level. There was no way he had learned that skill so quickly. A system notification appeared. The screen displayed his level up, but more importantly, he had fulfilled the conditions for a title. The title awarded was Fearless Immature Puppy, an F-rank designation that granted a +5 evasion boost. Though unimpressed by the title itself, he acknowledged that an evasion boost was always valuable. Another notification prompted him to allocate an unused bonus stat. Without hesitation, he invested it into the luck stat. Unlike in his past life, he had learned too late how crucial luck was for increasing skill hit rates and artifact drop chances. Now, it was a necessity. Daekyung finally stepped forward, still trying to process everything. He needed answers. He questioned whether this was truly Sang-hyun, pressing him on the skill he had just used. The way he fought, the abilities he displayed. None of it made sense. Demanding the truth, he asked where Sang-hyun had acquired such a powerful skill. Sang-hyun knew he couldn't reveal that he had regressed. Instead, he simply claimed he had received it upon awakening. But Daekyung wasn't convinced. Frustration boiling over, he insisted that it made no sense. There had to be more to it. He pressed further, suggesting that maybe Sang-hyun had gotten ridiculously lucky and obtained a diamond rank artifact, or something even higher. His gaze dropped to the longsword in Sang-hyun's hand, filled with suspicion. In response, Sang-hyun raised the weapon, offering Daekyung the chance to check for himself. Daekyung hesitated, torn between doubt and curiosity, but ultimately gave in. He examined the longsword closely, expecting to find some hidden effect or legendary enhancement. What he found instead was Faded Greatsword, an ordinary artifact with plus 50 attack power. No special abilities, no additional effects, just a standard weapon with a simple design. Daekyung let out an exasperated shout, confirming in disbelief that the longsword was truly nothing special. That left only one possibility. Sang-hyun's skill was genuinely his own. Realizing this, a wave of frustration hit him. He had been running dungeons for 2 years, and yet, even at level 50, he lacked skills of this caliber. A bitter thought crossed his mind. If this kept up, today's share of the pay would likely end up in Sang-hyun's hands. Before he could dwell on it further, a voice interrupted him. One of the porters called out, alerting him that the middle boss was approaching. A yellow-haired man glanced at Daekyung's reaction, concern evident in his expression. However, Daekyung simply instructed them to move forward. Taking out the weaker minions had been easy thanks to Sang-hyun, but he warned him not to get ahead of himself. The skills he had displayed so far wouldn't be enough against the demon orcs they would be facing soon. Sang-hyun was momentarily surprised but then smiled to himself. He had almost forgotten the real reason he had returned to this party after regressing. Turning to Daekyung, he called his name. Daekyung, still focused on the upcoming battle, assumed he was nervous and asked if he was scared. But instead, Sang-hyun asked if he could claim the artifact reward if he managed to defeat the demon orc alone. After all, their party paid based on individual performance. The Crimson Stone, an artifact that can only be obtained by defeating demon orcs, is known for its incredibly low drop rate, even after slaying hundreds of them. In his past life, after their team failed to defeat the demon orc, they had the rare opportunity to witness another party obtaining the Crimson Stone. He remembered seeing the other team's members congratulating their captain, asking how he had managed to acquire it, whether he thought it would fetch a high price in the market, and if it was truly one of the only artifacts possessing the delay skill. He knew that the delay skill was exactly what he desperately needed at this moment. Daekyung didn't respond to his earlier question, so he reminded them that, if his memory was correct, their party distributed loot based on contribution. If he were to defeat the monster alone, he assumed there would be no issue. However, Daekyung remained silent. Though concerned by Daekyung's reaction, he understood the importance of obtaining the delay skill now for future events. Unfortunately, most people looked down on cocky rookie players, and no one would take him seriously. As expected, the other players angrily approached him, demanding to know if he was crazy, questioning who he thought he was, and whether he truly believed he was special just because he had killed a few orcs. Stuttering slightly, he told them to calm down. Daekyung, however, simply responded that he could do as he pleased, shocking the other players. He then clarified that he would allow him to act freely, but only if they failed to defeat the boss. If that happened, he would be allowed to enter the dungeon on his own and kill it himself. Daekyung then looked at him seriously, asking if he understood. Realizing that things were going easier than he had anticipated, he replied that he supposed this meant he would be stepping out of the battle. Daekyung turned away, agreeing with him. Daekyung, however, was fuming. He found Sang-hyun unbearably arrogant, acting as if he were something special just because he had one broken skill. Daekyung swore to clear the dungeon himself and shut Sang-hyun up. Holding the door to the middle boss's chamber, he vowed to prove that experience was what truly mattered on the battlefield. Pushing the door open, Daekyung stepped inside, fully prepared to demonstrate his strength. However, the moment he laid eyes on the bloodthirsty demon orc waiting inside, his confidence wavered. Chains wrapped around the massive creature clinked ominously as it stared at them. Wasting no time, Daekyung ordered his team to prepare for battle. Though intimidating in appearance, the information he had gathered suggested it was easy to defeat. Confident in their strategy, he instructed his team to encircle it and attack from the rear. With a smirk, he assured Sang-hyun that he wouldn't even get the chance to interfere. Then, without hesitation, Daekyung dashed forward, shouting that he would take the lead. His team followed closely behind. Moments later, Daekyung was lying on the ground, bleeding. He sat up, barely able to comprehend what had just happened, stuttering as he asked what went wrong. On the sidelines, Sanghyun had been watching as they recklessly charged in. He sighed, wondering why they had simply rushed at it head-on. It dawned on him that this was exactly why they had failed back then too. One of the players frantically turned to Daekyung, asking what they should do and shouting that they were going to die at this rate. Daekyung, seething in frustration, questioned why the orcs were so strong, remembering how formidable the higher orcs had been before. Only now did he realize his mistake. He never should have relied on the advice he had picked up from the market. Gritting his teeth, he shouted for everyone to retreat, declaring that there was no need to defeat the boss today. Just as he was issuing the order, his eyes caught sight of Sanghyun standing off to the side. Unlike the rest of them, he wasn't panicked. He was smiling. Daekyung's confusion grew as one of the players, utterly baffled, yelled at Sanghyun, demanding to know what the hell was wrong with him. Snapping back to the situation at hand, Daekyung once again shouted for everyone to retreat. Since the bloodthirsty demon orc had poor peripheral vision, they could escape by slipping past its flank. The players, relieved at the escape plan, immediately moved to follow his orders. Before leaving, Daekyung turned to Sanghyun and reminded him that he had warned him beforehand. He added that Sanghyun shouldn't hold it against him if he ended up dying. Sanghyun simply sighed, assuring Daekyung that there was no need to worry, because he wouldn't be dying today. He stepped forward as the demon orc charged at him with its massive axe. If their stats were compared directly, he knew he would never be able to win. However, with all the experience he had gained, the demon orc was nothing. As the axe came down, he deflected it with his sword, surprising the orc. The players, watching from a distance, questioned whether they had just heard a clank and if Sanghyun had actually managed to deflect the orc's attack. Walking closer to the demon orc, he remarked that his hand stung from the impact and figured that merely deflecting its attacks was all he could do. His gaze then fell on the crimson stone, embedded deep in the monster's chest. It had been a while since he had last seen it. The reason he was so obsessed with obtaining the crimson stone was its special effect, the ability to combine the delay skill with his own demon bash. At first glance, Demon Bash's current 2-second stun seemed strong enough. However, using his Devour artifact skill, he could merge different skill effects, and the idea struck him. What if there was a way to stack the stun effect of Demon Bash? He knew that Demon Bash and Delay were the perfect combination, potentially granting him an infinite stun. If he could acquire the Delay skill, it would no longer be just a theory. It would become a reality. He then taunted the demon orc, asking if something was wrong before provoking it to attack again. Enraged, the monster roared and dashed toward him once more, swinging its axe with the intent to cut him in half. He remained calm, remarking that this was exactly what he wanted. The more it repeated its predictable patterns, the easier it became to find its weak spots. Timing his movement, he leaped and sliced its side. The demon orc momentarily released its grip on the axe as Demon Bash took effect, stunning it for 2 seconds. From a distance, Daekyung couldn't believe what he was witnessing. He shouted in disbelief that Demon Bash worked on middle bosses as well, calling it overpowered. However, Sanghyun simply mocked the orc, stating that while orcs were simple-minded, a demon orc should have been more formidable. Suddenly, the demon orc managed to shake off the stun and lashed out with a powerful kick. The attack connected, but Sanghyun barely managed to block it with his sword. The sheer force sent him flying backward, but he stopped himself by stabbing his sword into the ground. He realized he had forgotten about the demon orc's self-regeneration ability, which lifted the stun effect. To use Demon Bash again, he needed 15 seconds, which was exactly why he needed the delay skill. However, if stunning the monster wasn't an option, then defeating it outright was the only solution. The demon orc charged at him again, growling in rage. But instead of retreating, he stood his ground, deflecting the attack to the ground. While Daekyung and the other players watched from a distance, they were growing increasingly restless. One of them urgently told Daekyung that they needed to leave since even Sanghyun's stun skill wasn't working. However, Daekyung, deep in thought, simply asked why. He knew that Sanghyun's stun wasn't effective and that there was a massive gap between their stats, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He found himself wondering how Sanghyun could remain so calm in the face of such overwhelming power, and if he was truly just a newbie player. Meanwhile, Sanghyun was pushed back once again, but remained composed. He told the demon orc that he had faced situations like this many times before. If he wasn't strong enough, then rather than attempting to cut his enemy down, he needed to focus all his power on a single point and use the opponent's own strength against them. The demon orc charged at him once more. Timing his strike perfectly, he thrust his sword forward, piercing through its chest while simultaneously shattering its axe into pieces. The system message appeared, congratulating him for defeating the middle boss, Demon Orc. His level increased, and he obtained the E-rank title, Demon Hunter. The Demon Orc collapsed to the ground, lifeless. The system explained that the Demon Hunter title provided a 5-fold increase in health regeneration when facing middle bosses or stronger enemies. He noted that this was now his second title and assumed it was one of the benefits of being a solo player. However, as he turned to look around, he was met with the stunned faces of Daekyung and the other players. Realizing that this could turn into an annoying situation, one simple solution came to mind. He suddenly shouted, exclaiming that he had barely survived, then asked what they would have done if their leader, Daekyung, hadn't already weakened the boss. The players, caught off guard, immediately latched onto his words, shouting that they knew it all along. They turned to Daekyung, demanding to know when exactly he had dealt damage to the Demon Orc. Daekyung, still confused, was about to question Sang-hyun when he caught sight of the look on his face. The subtle, knowing gaze seemed to be asking if Daekyung was really that stupid, or if he understood the favor being extended to him. The unspoken message was clear. Sang-hyun was giving him a chance to save face. Before Daekyung could respond, the Crimson Stone floated out of the Demon Orc's corpse, glowing ominously. He realized that Sang-hyun was waiting for him to uphold his promise. With a bitter expression, he mumbled to himself that this was his complete defeat. Determined not to dwell on the matter, Daekyung quickly turned to the team and instructed them to pay attention. Now that they had defeated the middle boss, they needed to prepare for the final boss. The players agreed, and as they headed upstairs, they murmured among themselves, saying that there was no way Sang-hyun had defeated the Demon Orc alone and speculating about what had actually happened. Left alone before the Demon Orc's corpse, Sang-hyun finally turned his attention to the Crimson Stone. He stared at it for a moment before muttering to himself, wondering if he should just eat it. The system then displayed its details. A silver artifact with the special effect Delay, increasing health and strength by 10. It was a crystallization of strength, tenacity, and endurance. Activating mana synchronization, he entered his gap of unconsciousness space, causing his hair to shift into a radiant white. As he stood there, he was momentarily stunned to see the Crimson Stone transform into a steaming bowl of Master Chef's bibim naengmyeon, complete with meat jelly. Grinning, he grabbed the chopsticks, marveling at the turn of events. Asking himself if things were really going his way, he admitted that there was no way he could resist such a classic combination. Without hesitation, he picked up a perfect bite, noodles and pork together, and ate it wholeheartedly. Per the 20% base stat absorption rate of silver rank artifacts, his strength and health stats each increased by 2. Just minutes later, the bowl was empty, and with it, he had successfully acquired the special effect, Delay. A system notification appeared, revealing that he could now bind Delay to his existing skills. That thought alone sent a nervous excitement through him. Without hesitation, he bound Delay to his Demon Bash skill. The system immediately processed the effect and explained the enhancement. If Demon Bash was used again before the first stunned state ended, it would extend the stun duration. The second stun would be guaranteed. The third stun had a 90% chance of success. The fourth stun had a 60% chance of success. Any further consecutive uses had a 30% chance of maintaining the chain. He emerged from the gap of unconsciousness, completely shocked. Theoretically, he had only guessed that a 4-second stun loop was possible, but he never imagined it would actually work. Before he could fully process it, Daekyung appeared behind him and asked if they could talk. He agreed, turning to ask Daekyung what was on his mind. Daekyung explained that right in front of them was the final boss room, the Orc Berserker. He nodded, then casually asked if Daekyung wanted him to join in later. However, Daekyung firmly replied no, which caught him by surprise. Clarifying, Daekyung admitted that he would be a failure of a leader if he didn't fully utilize a teammate like him. Extending his hand, Daekyung proposed that they work together. Laughing, he shook Daekyung's hand, but reminded him that his conditions still stood. Without hesitation, Daekyung agreed. At that moment, the yellow-haired player called out, announcing that the party was ready to enter the boss room. Daekyung responded with a nod, instructing everyone to stay on guard. As they prepared to move, the yellow-haired player shot him an intense glare, making him momentarily both surprised and confused. Daekyung, unaware of the silent exchange, cheerfully shouted that they were at the final stretch and that they should celebrate with drinks afterward. While the rest of the party walked ahead, he remained behind for a moment, wondering if he had imagined it or if the yellow-haired player really had glared at him. Dungeon number 85, the final boss room. Upon entering, they were met with the low growl of the Orc Berserker, its massive frame rising slowly as it stood up. As the party positioned themselves, Daekyung turned to him and stated that he would go in first. Instead, he stepped forward first, gripping his longsword. Without turning back, he told Daekyung to just stick with him. Daekyung immediately objected, warning him that he shouldn't go alone this time. However, he simply sighed. The Orc Berserker actually had lower skill resistance than Demon Orcs, meaning that stunning it should be easier. If he kept his attacks controlled and calm, there shouldn't be any issues. Then, with explosive speed, he dashed forward. The orc berserker roared, charging toward him with its mace, club, and flail ready to strike. As he ran toward the beast, a fleeting thought crossed his mind. Had he ever spoken such confident words before? When he was young, he had always been afraid. When he grew older, he had simply struggled to survive. But now, he couldn't allow himself to live that kind of life again. As the orc berserker's attack came down, he deflected it with his sword. His mind was clear. He needed to change his weak past, to change his future. The orc berserker, enraged, lunged at him again. But this time, he didn't hesitate. He calmly lifted his longsword, knowing that to change everything, he needed to prove it, to everyone here. Daekyung, watching from the sidelines, was left in utter shock as he witnessed Sang-hyun sever the orc berserker's arm in a single slash, causing it to scream in agony. Mumbling in disbelief, Daekyung could only manage to say one thing: he's a monster. He then shouted to the others that the orc berserker would be stunned for 4 seconds and instructed them to go in and nuke it. They followed his lead, rushing toward the orc. It screamed in pain as they relentlessly slashed at it again and again. Minutes later, the system congratulated them for defeating the final boss, the orc berserker, and for clearing the dungeon altar of the Crimson Orc. The players exchanged glances, commenting on how easy the dungeon felt. Some noted that they hadn't even used any potions and finally understood just how effective the stun effect was. Meanwhile, he overheard the leader of the porters asking if anyone thought he had a personal porter yet, and if he should ask him. Another porter responded that he had been planning to ask first. The porter leader then shouted to his members that he needed to make a living too, leaving Sang-hyun in disbelief at how quickly their attitudes had shifted. He hadn't even been considering anything for them. The system then notified him that he had leveled up and obtained the D-rank title with overwhelming power. As his level increased, he felt the pressure weigh on him while the system explained that the title extended the duration of status effects by 10%. He recognized this as a real harvest. Titles were rare, and in his previous life, he had never acquired them. A 4.4-second stun was already powerful, but he also knew it was nothing compared to Do Gyung-soo, the Ghost Blade, the title collector, the complete sword, and the strongest swordsman player in Korea. Only 2 years after the Age of Players began, Gyung-soo had become a monster who surpassed level 500. Before he regressed, Gyung-soo had been someone he admired from a distance. But now, there was no reason to think he couldn't catch up. If he pushed himself from now on, he might actually have a chance. The realization filled him with excitement and determination. Daekyung noticed his expression and asked what he was doing. Flustered, he awkwardly responded that he was just stretching. Daekyung praised him for his great work and handed him an artifact, which shocked him. He asked Daekyung what had gotten into him. Daekyung simply stated that he had really carried the team this time and that he had a sense of morality. He added that it was just bronze rank, so he could afford to be generous. Sang-hyun raised an eyebrow and asked if he wasn't being a little too honest. Daekyung smirked and replied that if it had been expensive, he wouldn't have given it to him. The truth was, Daekyung was giving it to him because this would be the last time they saw each other. It hurt, but even he had to admit it. Sang-hyun was already living in a different world from them. Meanwhile, the yellow-haired player watched from behind, seething with rage. He couldn't believe Daekyung was favoring Sang-hyun just because he had shown off his skills a few times. After all the years he had been Daekyung's loyal follower, he now felt tossed aside. Frustrated, he muttered to himself, questioning if it wasn't too unfair. His frustration turned to resentment as he cursed them both under his breath. Then, without hesitation, he pulled out his phone and made a call. Later, Sang-hyun's house, Songpa District, Jamsil-dong. Sang-hyun screamed in joy, overwhelmed with excitement. This was exactly why he became a player. Checking his bank account, he saw 6 million yuan and couldn't believe it. Porters typically only made around $200 a day, yet Daekyung had given him more than double what the others received, plus a bonus on top of it. That bonus turned out to be the Berserker Ring, a bronze artifact with the lightened special effect and plus 10 strength. The ring was designed to draw out the blood rage of its wearer. Even though it was only bronze rank, he still couldn't believe he had gotten an artifact with lighten for free. The effect consumed 1 mana per second to reduce the weight of all equipped artifacts to 1 gram. He understood why it was only bronze rank. Most players would run out of mana before even swinging their swords, but he wasn't most players. Sang-hyun had only discovered his ability after 50 years, but that was exactly why he had studied it so intensely. In his previous life, he had experimented with devouring countless mana-reliant artifacts. The results had been shocking. Artifacts that required mana did receive a penalty when consumed, but they also lost their mana cost entirely. He smirked to himself as he began synchronizing his mana with the Berserker Ring. He didn't care if there was a penalty. To him, the more skills, the better. Later, Private Club H, Gangnam District, Seoul. The yellow-haired player slammed his glass onto the table, frustrated. He insisted to the man in front of him that he wasn't lying, Sang-hyun really had a 4-second stun. The huge man across from him narrowed his eyes and asked if he was raising his voice. Panic immediately set in, and the yellow-haired player quickly apologized. The man took a slow sip of his drink before asking what he expected him to do about it. The yellow-haired player hesitated for a moment before explaining that Sang-hyun was definitely loaded and must have used some stun-related artifact. The man, unimpressed, asked again what exactly he wanted from him. The yellow-haired player insisted that he wasn't talking about revenge, but business. He pointed out that Daekyung clearly favored Sang-hyun now. The man leaned forward, repeating that he wanted revenge. From the side, a woman whispered that she had been right about how close they were. The man then called the yellow-haired player by name, his tone shifting to something serious. Before he could respond, pain shot through him as something sharp sliced through his head. A second later, he realized his ear had been cut off. His screams echoed through the club as he clutched the side of his face, blood dripping onto his clothes. The man stood in his chair, swirling his drink, and asked who he thought he was. He then threw a bottle of alcohol over the fresh wound, causing a new wave of agonized screams to erupt from the yellow-haired player. Arrogantly, the man told him that he had better pay the price and that he would listen, as much as the worth of his ear allowed. He asked the question that sent a chill through the room. Where the hell was Sang-hyun? The next day, at the Jamsil 4-3 training grounds, he sat down to rest, still processing how the Berserker ring had changed everything. His stomach rumbled, a lingering effect of its consumption, but he reminded himself that light always followed darkness. Lifting his long sword, he rolled it in his grip, reached for its handle mid-spin, and caught it effortlessly. The weapon felt significantly lighter, a result of the ring's lightweight effect. With the Devour artifact's skill, its mana cost had been erased, but as a penalty, the effect had been halved. Even so, the weight reduction was substantial enough that switching to a greatsword seemed like the best option for now. Opening his status window, he examined his stats. He had reached level 7, possessed 3 titles, had no constellation yet, and his current stats showed 325 health, 32 mana points, and 307 experience points. As he assessed his progress, one thought became clear. He needed to start drawing the attention of the constellations. Since a player could only form a contract with one, the choice required careful consideration. Ideally, he would want one that complemented his strongest stat, luck. However, without the necessary attributes to pique their interest, there was only one thing to do: train. After 3 days of rigorous training and long-distance driving, he finally arrived, stepping out of the car and stretching his sore back. The exhaustion weighed on him, but he took comfort in the fact that he had acquired a new skill: ambidextrous sword training level 1. The skill enhanced his adaptability with all swords except daggers and one-handed longswords, a valuable addition to his growing arsenal. Looking ahead, he focused on dungeon number 101, a solo player exclusive dungeon. Normally, players waited months for a chance to enter one, making it a rare opportunity that he had been able to drive out here. Just as he was about to step inside, the sound of a nearby vehicle caught his attention. Glancing back, he noticed a dark car pulling up on the road. It was clear that someone had followed him through the forest. He didn't know what they wanted, but whatever it was, it would be settled inside the dungeon. The moment he entered, his pursuers followed. 4 men from the bar trailed behind, their leader glancing around in confusion upon seeing him seated calmly on a nearby rock, as if waiting for them. They had no reason to believe they had entered the wrong dungeon. This was a solo player instance, meant for only one person at a time. The massive man among them sneered, questioning his sanity. Unbothered, he gripped his longsword, knowing that this group was far from ordinary. The absence of a healer and mage meant they had abandoned sustainability, forming a party consisting solely of swordsmen and an archer. This setup left no doubt in his mind. They were a hyena pack, a group specializing in hunting other players. The brown-haired man among them warned that if he died here, even his body wouldn't be found. Sang-hyun merely smiled, fully aware of the risks. The hyenas had been eradicated in his past life by the relentless surveillance of the Players Association, but at this moment in time, they still operated freely. Among their ranks, the archer posed the greatest threat, a fact he had already factored into his approach. The archer urged his teammates to finish things quickly, unaware that this was precisely what Sang-hyun had planned for. Eliminating 4 bodies required a perfect setting, and a solo dungeon provided just that. The brute among them moved forward, cursing loudly, but their leader raised a hand, opting for a more calculated approach. The brute, unconvinced, swore vengeance and promised to make him suffer. Sang-hyun, amused, noted how obedient the brute had been to his leader's orders. He had no patience for drawn-out fights and challenged them all to come at him simultaneously. With a twisted grin, the brute lunged forward, swinging a massive sword and threatening to silence him permanently. Sang-hyun remained motionless, waiting for the attack. Dungeons adhered to the law of survival of the fittest. Monsters constantly sought to claim his life, and within these treacherous spaces, artifacts and rewards awaited those strong enough to claim them. There were no laws, no rules, only the brutal reality that the weak perished. It was a truth he had learned through experience, one that still held firm. The moment the brute's attack descended, a single slash cut through the tension. Blood splattered across the dungeon floor. The remaining men stood frozen, their expressions contorted in shock. The brute's severed torso collapsed to the ground in 2 pieces, his weapon clattering beside him. He shifted his gaze toward the remaining 3, his voice carrying a calm, almost indifferent tone. The remaining men sprinted past him, their leader quickly ordering them to keep their distance. The archer was instructed to cover them while they repositioned. Without hesitation, the archer dashed to the side, calling out his readiness, though his mind still reeled from what had just happened. He couldn't believe that Sang-hyun had killed Sang-ho, the brute, among them. Even if Sang-hyun was reckless, he had somehow managed to reach level 100 despite only awakening recently. Sang-hyun casually spun his sword before glancing in their direction. Amused, he questioned where they thought they were going. The archer responded instantly, loosing 2 arrows in quick succession. With effortless precision, Sang-hyun slashed them to pieces mid-air, leaving the archer momentarily stunned before he shouted in disbelief. Before the archer could react further, Sang-hyun hurled his greatsword, the massive weapon cutting through the air before impaling the archer's body. The remaining 2 men froze in shock. Their leader, unable to comprehend what had just happened, muttered in disbelief. The brown-haired man beside him, visibly shaken, questioned who they were even dealing with. As the leader assessed the situation, his gaze landed on Sang-hyun. At that moment, he realized that Sang-hyun had thrown away his only weapon. Seeing an opportunity, he ordered the brown-haired man to strike while Sang-hyun, now unarmed, rushed toward his embedded sword. The 2 men charged at him simultaneously. Just as Sang-hyun reached for his weapon, he caught a glimpse of them swinging their swords down at him from both sides. He barely dodged in time, the force of their attacks slicing through the archer's lifeless body instead. The 2 men recoiled in shock, their eyes widening at the sight of their fallen ally reduced to pieces. Still hanging upside down from his evasive maneuver, Sang-hyun casually remarked on how close that had been. The brown-haired man, shaken, called him insane, but Sang-hyun simply pulled his sword free. Suddenly, the leader seized the brown-haired man by the head. Panic flashed across the man's face as he called out his leader's name, Jun-tae, demanding to know what he was doing. Without hesitation, Jun-tae yanked the man's head forward, using him as a human shield, just as Sang-hyun's sword carved an X-shaped slash through the air. The attack connected, cleaving through the brown-haired man's torso while also severing part of Jun-tae's fingers in the process. Jun-tae staggered back, gripping his wounded hand. Before he could recover, Sang-hyun landed on the ground and observed him with cold amusement. Then, as if confirming a suspicion, Sang-hyun calmly asked if they were organ dealers. The unexpected accusation left Jun-tae momentarily stunned. Sang-hyun continued, stating that there was no way a group like theirs operated under trust or camaraderie. He speculated that their true goal involved mana stone awakenings through organ transplants. Despite his casual tone, his certainty was clear. He had seen too much in his past life to be mistaken. Jun-tae, after a brief silence, suddenly let out a dark chuckle. Dismissing the revelation as irrelevant, he surged forward in a final act of desperation, thrusting his sword directly towards Sang-hyun's head. The blade stopped mere inches from its target. Sang-hyun had activated Demon Bash. Smirking, he remarked that he had only been asking out of curiosity. Jun-tae's eyes widened as his body froze in place, the system stunning him for 4 seconds. His mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. He recalled the minor cuts from earlier, but he refused to believe that something so small could have paralyzed him. The possibility of such a broken skill existing was unfathomable. As Sang-hyun approached, he casually informed Jun-tae that it was over. A wave of denial washed over Jun-tae. This couldn't be happening. He had always been the one in control, the one who decided who lived and who died. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. A fragmented memory surfaced in his mind. He had once assured his underlings that as long as they followed him, they could achieve anything. They had believed in him, praised him. But not long after, one of those same men had been reduced to a trembling mess, bleeding profusely and begging for his life. The desperate voice echoed in Jun-tae's mind, pleading for mercy, promising to do anything if only he would be spared. Jun-tae had ignored it, severing the man's arm without hesitation. Even then, the pleading had continued. He had always been the predator. Now, trembling in fear for the first time, Jun-tae found himself staring at Sang-hyun, who had drawn close enough to whisper a chilling question. Had he never experienced this feeling before? Was he afraid now that it was his turn? Jun-tae couldn't answer. A moment later, the surface of the pond rippled as blood spread through the water. On its edge, Sang-hyun calmly cleaned his sword, watching as the crimson stain dispersed. He reminded himself that he couldn't afford to become accustomed to situations like this. It hadn't been long since he regressed, and yet he knew there was little chance of him ever becoming a constellation. He reasoned that this had all been self-defense. Glancing back at the pile of weapons behind him, he watched as the system displayed his latest rewards. 8 artifacts had been obtained from this dungeon. He slipped his coat on as the system displayed his latest progress. His level had increased by 10, and his consumed artifacts now totaled 11. His health had risen to 400, his mana by 50, and all his stats had improved significantly. While he wished the earlier fight could have been avoided, the results made it entirely worth it. He couldn't help but be relieved that consuming artifacts didn't make him gain weight. Based on his current stats, he was already as strong as players who had reached level 50. The rapid growth made him wonder just how long it had been since his regression. His progress was nothing short of insane. Reaching into his pocket, he retrieved a silver artifact, the Recovery Ring. Its special effect allowed for instant removal of status abnormalities, consuming 10 mana per use. However, if activated again within the next minute, the mana cost would double. He still couldn't believe that the brute who had charged at him earlier had been carrying an artifact like this. The realization struck him. If he had placed all his trust in his stun ability, he could have been in serious trouble. The thought made him shudder slightly. Deciding to be more cautious in the future, he immediately began the mana synchronization process with the Recovery Ring. The scene then shifts to a group of goblins trudged along the pathway when one of them sensed a presence behind them. Turning around, it spotted him standing there, his longsword in hand, eyes covered as he slowly approached. He knew that obtaining the Lucky Day title required something absurd, killing 500 monsters with his eyes closed. As the goblins recoiled in shock, their confusion grew when they noticed the eerie glow of his sword. Sighing in frustration, he wondered how long they would just stand there before attacking. A soft growl finally escaped one of the goblins, surprising him. He could sense their presence without seeing them. Understanding the importance of heightened perception, he focused on feeling the movement of air, sharpening his hearing, and maintaining absolute concentration. He entered a heightened state, the unconscious space, where instinct took over. The goblins hesitated before launching their attack, axes raised. He remained still until the last moment. As soon as they drew near, he moved. His sword arced through the air, effortlessly cleaving through multiple goblins in a single sweep. Blood rained down. But instead of being disturbed, he found himself enjoying the sensation. A sudden shift in the air caught his attention. An arrow flew toward him. Without thinking, he reached out and caught it mid-flight. Breaking it in half with his bare hands, he smirked, realizing he had started to get the hang of it. The goblin archer froze in disbelief. Without hesitation, he advanced, recognizing that the events of the past few days had helped refine his senses. He called out to the goblins, taunting them as they charged at him in fury. Blade in hand, he moved through them like a storm, cutting down every goblin that dared to get close. His grin widened with each fallen enemy. Minutes passed, and soon, only one goblin remained. It barely had time to scream before he dashed forward, driving his sword straight through its body. Blood coated his weapon, and as the final goblin fell, the system registered his accomplishment. His level had increased again, and he had obtained the D-rank Lucky Day title. Removing the cover from his eyes, he expected to feel accomplished, but instead felt like he hadn't done much at all. The system displayed the details of his new title. Lucky Day, a D-rank title, granted plus 20 luck. Additionally, whenever he defeated the same type of monster, his luck stat would increase by 0.1, with a maximum gain of 10. Laughter escaped him as he realized that he was slowly accumulating the titles he needed. Another goblin appeared from the shadows, only to freeze in horror upon seeing the carnage before it, its kin lying in pieces, drowning in their own blood. He smiled, recognizing another opportunity for free stats. As more goblins approached, he welcomed them, eager to take full advantage of his new title. By the time the battle was over, his luck stat had increased by 30. Trembling slightly, he let out a laugh, ecstatic over the absurdity of his progress. A single title had boosted his luck more than most platinum-ranked titles ever could. Considering its potential value, he estimated it could easily be worth 500 million, perhaps even a billion. But then, a distortion in space caught his attention. Behind him, a dimensional rift opened. His heart pounded with excitement. The system then showed that 3 constellations had arrived for him. The cleaner of a fallen dimension asked if he was interested in making others unlucky. The pilgrim of grand space was intrigued by his mysteriousness and requested a conversation. The goddess of luck was smiling at him, reaching out her hand.